name is Steve Gates. I'm the Dean of the Bren School here. It's great to see such a good turnout. And I want to welcome you to the Zurich Financial Services Distinguished Visitors Program. This is the 8th year of this program, and it has allowed us to bring in leading global scholars in a whole variety of different areas and dimensions, from law and policy and science and business, issues related to climate change. And so it's had a very big impact on us to bring in leading scholars to a public presentation as you're going to hear today, but also spend some time, anywhere from a week to an entire quarter, working with our students and teaching classes and workshops on some of the latest issues related to climate change. So it's been an incredibly impactful program that has been supported and endowed by Zurich Financial Services. And I want to acknowledge David Seller-Smith here, who is representing Zurich Financial Services today, and thank you for representing and the support that David is a policy development analyst, and he's worked on all kinds of interesting issues within farmers insurance on such things as self-driving cars and climate resilience and cybersecurity, flood and wildfire mitigation. So really, really interesting and detailed analyses on kind of the underlying science and policy as it relates to the insurance industry. And so thank you very much for joining us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to David Tillman to introduce this year's speaker.
Well, it's a pleasure to introduce John Krebs. John is an amazing scholar, an animal-ecologist, behaviorist, evolutionist, who spent much of his career working on birds in a place called Wytham Woods near Oxford. He is prolific in publications, many books, over 300 papers in the scientific literature. Received many honors. He's a member of the Royal Society, a foreign member of the U.S. National Academy of Science, of the U.S. American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of the U.S. Philosophical Society. In addition to those things, he has something which we can never have, is against our Constitution of the United States. He was knighted for his science. He was Sir John. And he also has done an immense amount at the interface between science and policy. So all of us know the frustrations and occasional joys that happen at interface, and John knows them better than any of us, and he's been particularly effective at bridging this gap between science and policy. And that might be why, besides, frankly, his utter brilliance and other traits he has, why he was appointed to become a lifelong member of the House of Lords, where he serves and is a voting member and helps in that legislative part as well as the policy part of the United Kingdom. And just in case you don't know, the House of Lords is somewhat analogous to the U.S. Senate in the United States. So anyway, without taking more of your time, John, it's an immense pleasure to introduce Lord Krebs of Wytham.
Luckily, I've got a few spare PowerPoint slides so I can expand it up to the available time. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to join in thanking Zurich for the endowment of this post that I'm currently holding here. And it's very exciting for me to come back to Santa Barbara. I hate to confess this, but actually the last time I gave a talk here at UCSB was in 1972. So it's been a long while, but it's great to get back, and the Pacific Ocean still looks the same as it did then, which is great. Now, what I'm going to do today is to talk about the reality of implementing legislation to respond to the challenge of climate change. So this is not going to be a talk about the science of climate change, I'm taking that as a given, nor is it going to be a talk about the kind of global perspective on what climate change means for refugees, for small islands and states, and so on. But I'm going to take as the starting point what happened just before Christmas in Paris. Partly because for the first time in my life, I wrote a blog about Paris. When I say I wrote a blog, somebody wrote it for me. and the blog was called Paris, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Because a lot of people asked me, as I'm sure asked other people who work in the field of climate change policy, was Paris a good thing or a bad thing? And the answer is it depends on whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person. So what happened in Paris? If you're a glass half full kind of person, there's some very good news. 195 countries accepted that limiting climate change, global change to around 2 degrees is an important target, the so-called safe level of climate change, although it's not a switch, it's not all or nothing, but it's a reasonably good target to aim for on the basis of the consequences of climate change as projected by climate models. It was good news because the way this agreement was reached was not through a top-down process, but a bottom-up process. The countries arrived with their intended nationally determined contributions, known as INDCs in the jargon of climate politics. Everybody turned up with their piece of paper with their INDC, which they had, of course, prepared before, and it's agreed that these will be reviewed on a 5-yearly basis, and that if necessary, they'll be ratcheted up. So people will have to make stronger commitments. At the same time, it's recognised that however good these commitments are, adaptation to climate change will be an important part of the picture, and there was an agreement on finance for developing countries, rising to $100 billion a year by 2020. So that's the good news. On the other hand, the bad news is that the current commitments that people turned up to Paris with will not lead to meeting the 2-degree target, will probably lead to a rise of global average temperature, which is more like 3 degrees. Importantly, there's no system for policing or properly standardizing the reporting of these commitments. So if certain countries chose to cheat, there's no way of checking on that, or there's no standardized way of ensuring that there isn't cheating. Thirdly, on the bad news side, it's all very well to talk about ratcheting up, but ratcheting up takes a long time. So it's not enough to say in 5 years' time, oh dear, we need to do a bit more, let's turn on the, put on the gas pedal tomorrow. It may take decades to ratchet up. And then perhaps most dangerous of all, the leaders of some countries of these 195 went back home to their national assemblies and said, fine, Paris is great, we don't need to do anything, it's business as usual, which it clearly shouldn't be. And this is just illustrating the gap between what the commitments were made in Paris indicate and what needs to be done. Can we just dim the lights at the front a little bit to make these slightly clearer? But what you should be able to see here is my pointer isn't. They turned it on for me, but I seem to have done something with it. But the sort of orangey line at the top, wedge, is current policies. The slightly paler orangey is if the pledges made in Paris are actually met. But the green is, thank you, I was certainly there. So this is what's business as usual. This is if the pledges are met, and this is the gap between the pledges in Paris and what would need to be done to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees, or 1.5, which is what some people talk about in Paris, and this is time along here up to 2030, and this is emissions ranges in CO2 equivalents. So the gap is huge. So Paris certainly didn't produce the end of the story, but it might, if you're an optimist, produce the beginning of the story. But I want to talk within that overall framework. What is happening in one small country, a little cold, wet, windy island off the north coast of France, known as the United Kingdom, because this is a country in which, as I will explain as the story unfolds, has passed arguably the most stringent climate legislation of any country in the world, passed into law. And the question is, if you take a country that is wealthy, is well educated, has very, very strict laws about climate change, what is actually happening there? And does that give us some indication of the likelihood of a global change of the kind that we hope for out of Paris? Now, just to simplify the story, I'm not going to go into the details because it is complicated of how the different countries within the United Kingdom, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, all have slightly different different roles in this overarching UK legislation. So I'm going to pretend that the United Kingdom is one country, whereas in fact it's 4 separate countries with slightly different bits of legislation. You may be wondering what this is at the top. This is not to scale, but that is the Shetland Islands that belong somewhere up here that are part of Scotland, but they're near Norway. So in 2008, when I was a relative new boy in the upper house of our parliament, the government of the day, which was a Labour government, a left-wing government, proposed an act called the Climate Change Act. A bill came before Parliament, and all parties agreed that this bill was passed with a massive majority in both houses of Parliament. And what the bill does is to say that by 2050, the United Kingdom has to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% below 1990 levels. It does this by a system of 5 yearly carbon budgets starting in 2008. So each 5 years a budget is proposed, passed into law, and then the government is obliged to meet that budget. At the same time, recognising reports of adaptation, the Act required the government to produce a national adaptation programme. How is the country going to prepare for the inevitable risks and consequences of climate change? Most importantly, the Act set up a mechanism by which all of this will be scrutinised. And that is an independent, completely independent committee called the Climate Change Committee, of which I'm a member, and it has a committee that deals with mitigation and a subcommittee that deals with adaptation. And I chair the adaptation subcommittee and sit on the mitigation committee. And that is a committee established by statute, and it has a duty, as I say, to advise the government both on the mitigation target, how to get to 2050, and how to prepare for the impacts of climate change, but also to report on a regular basis to Parliament on how the executive is doing. So it's both advisory and a watchdog. So it's a pretty powerful system on the face of it. So let's have a look at what the challenge is. But first of all, why this number of 80% below 1990? I've lost the slide. Anyway, never mind. I will explain why 80% below 1990. It's actually a global equity argument. If you model how much carbon we as a world can emit by 2050 in order to stabilize emissions at roughly the level that would lead to a 2 degree centigrade average global temperature rise, the per capita allocation, if everybody in the world had the same carbon allowance, will be around 2 tons of carbon per person per year. When we started from 1990, the average person in the UK was emitting 10 tons of carbon per year. So to go from 10 down to 2 is an 8% reduction. At the same time, in the United States, the average person was emitting 20 tons of carbon per year. So in the US, to meet a comparable target would require a 90% reduction. I did have a slide I thought that explained that, but it seemed to vanish. Anyway, I'm going to now talk about how the United Kingdom is doing in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions in light of this Climate Change Act. And this, first of all, sets out the scale of the challenge. So there we were in 1990, and this is a stack chart showing the sources of megatons of CO2 equivalent. So the blue at the bottom is the power sector, that's electricity generation, then the red is industry, then there's buildings, heating buildings, then there's transport, agriculture and land use change, waste and F-gases, and finally, international aviation and shipping. I'm going to come back to that because the Act was slightly ambiguous about whether international aviation and shipping should be included, and we at the Climate Change Committee assumed it should. The government's argument is, well, at the moment we don't have an international agreement on how to divvy it up. Supposing you take an airline flight that goes from Frankfurt to San Francisco and stops off in London, and it has mainly Japanese tourists on board, does that count as our emissions? Does it count as the German emissions? Does it count as Japanese? Or does it count as the US? And we don't have it yet an agreed mechanism for divvying it up. But the Climate Change Committee view is that is no excuse, because we will have to find a mechanism, because aviation and shipping emissions are important. So we should keep them in the picture. So there we were, roughly 800 megatons, and we've got to get down to roughly 160. That's the 80% reduction over a period of 60 years. Where we've got to today, this is actually 2014, so it's just over a year ago, is a 33% reduction. And I'm going to talk about whether that's good news or bad news. And we'll come to that as I unpackage the story. But what you can see from this stack chart, there's no one magic bullet, because the greenhouse gas emissions are spread over everything we do in our lives. It's turning on the lights, it's moving around, it's manufacturing stuff, it's growing food, and so on. So there isn't a simple thing that you can point to that will crack the problem. This was the slide that was supposed to be a bit earlier on, showing this is modeling temperature range of hot 5 degrees or more, and this is the total greenhouse gas emissions. And I said that 2 degrees, which is the green bit, is compatible with having 1.8 to 2.9 CO2 equivalent per year per person, and implies about an 80% reduction relative to 1990 in the UK. So the Climate Change Committee then has to advise the government on how it's going to make this massive leap from 800 down to 160. And we can't just pull things out of the air. We have to, there's a set of rules laid down in the Act which says we have to take note of what the climate science is telling us. We have to take note of what is technically feasible, technological feasibility. We have to take note of the economics, the impact on competitiveness. I mean, we could say, well, simply stop generating electricity tomorrow. We'll all, live in the dark and wear hair shirts and so on. That's not allowed. We also have to take note of what's happening elsewhere, particularly in Europe, because the 27 member states of the European Union also have climate change law that affects all of us, and we have to make sure that we are embedded and consistent with that. And the Act also requires us to take note of what every other country in the world is doing. So, in broad outline, very simplifying, the approach that we've advised the government for the last, since 2009, when we produced our first report of advice over the last 7 years, is that a strong emphasis should be on decarbonising electricity generation. Because that allows you then, if you think of that stack chart, you can take the carbon out of the power generation, the bottom part of the stack chart, and you can use decarbonised electricity to run other stuff, vehicles or heating or industry processes. Then you also reduce the size of the other elements of the stack chart. But that won't be enough on its own, so there has to be a huge push to increase the efficiency with which you use energy. And a tricky one, which I'll come back to, is agricultural emissions. Just to say that at the moment, agricultural emissions in the UK are about 9% of our greenhouse gas footprint. If we did nothing about agriculture and did a lot about everything else, by 2050 they would be over 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So agriculture's got to play its part, and as I've explained, that's in some ways trickier than the other sectors. So I'm going to focus a little bit at the beginning of this on energy generation. In 1990, this was the generation in the United Kingdom. The black is coal, so we rely very heavily on coal, which is our tradition going back to the fact that Britain sits on a vast amount of coal, and that's been the traditional source of energy. We had about just under 20%, 16% nuclear, and then a tiny amount of renewable energy. Things have changed a lot. In 2014, coal had been replaced to a very substantial extent by gas. Nuclear stayed about the same. A very big increase, obviously, from a very low base in renewable generation. This bit at the top, the green, called imports, is when we are short of electricity, we import it from France. France generates most of its electricity, over 80%, by nuclear. So that import essentially is nuclear. And projecting forward, the Climate Change Committee has not specified a particular mix, but this is, for instance, that by 2030, coal will have disappeared completely, nuclear will be expanding, there'll be some gas, a huge expansion of renewable, and the new thing at the top in red is carbon capture and storage, which is maybe will become a bigger issue. The UK is uniquely placed to benefit from carbon capture and storage technology because we have taken a very large quantity of oil and gas out from underneath the North Sea in the last 50 years, leaving a vast amount of space for storing carbon dioxide in a secure rock underneath the North Sea if we have the technology to get it there. That was just an illustration of one sector, the power sector, of how things might change. But each year we report to Parliament on how the executive is doing. We report on greenhouse gas emissions and the policies to reduce them. And every year since 2009 we've said that the government isn't doing enough. Yesterday, as it happened, I just read in the news clips, our Prime Minister appeared in front of a parliamentary committee, a scrutiny committee, and he said, and I quote, it was utter and total nonsense to say that the UK was not doing enough to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And what he quotes is that the government is on target, which is true. Remarkably, despite the fact we keep on saying you're not doing enough, government, here is the path that we think is the most cost-effective path from 1990 to 2050. And here's a little bit for international aviation shipping, which at the moment isn't in, but we think it should be. This is projecting forward the path we've got to go on. These are the 4 carbon budgets that have been passed into law. We have just proposed the 5th carbon budget, which takes you up to the early 2030s. We don't know yet whether the government will pass it into law. But the government has so far followed, or the country has followed, roughly speaking, the trajectory that we said it needed to. So in a way, the Prime Minister is right to say, well, it's utter nonsense that we're not doing enough, because we are on track. However, the reason the government is on track is quite largely for circumstances other than policies to do with climate change. And obviously, it's one of those situations that it gets harder and harder as you go lower. So it may be relatively easy, low-hanging fruit to get to here, but the things you do at this sort of stage in your life will affect whether or not you can get down here in 10, 20, 30 years' time. So our point is that it's all very well to say we're on track now, but that doesn't mean to say you're doing the things that you need to do in order to get to where you need to be in 2050. So how come the government is on track? Well, there are really a number of things. First of all, I've already mentioned the switch from coal to gas to electricity generation, which has mainly been driven by price, that gas has become much cheaper. We have reduced our manufacturing sector, so we now manufacture more stuff in China than we used to, and we replace manufacturing by service industries. Now, the Act only refers to greenhouse gases produced within the UK. It doesn't talk about consumption-based accounting, only production-based accounting. So that's, in a way, good news for the UK, although bad news for other countries. The economic downturn following the 2008 financial crisis meant that the economic growth in the UK stopped essentially for 4 or 5 years, and even though it's now returned to 2 to 3% a year, it's on a trajectory which is quite a bit below what it would have been pre-2008. So, as one member of the House of Lords said in debates a couple of years ago, the government's most effective climate policy to date has been the 2008 financial crash. There has been, nevertheless, as I showed in the earlier slide, a very substantial, albeit on a low base, increase in renewable electricity generation, particularly offshore wind. The world's largest offshore wind farm is the so-called London Array, just off the coast of England near the mouth of the River Thames. And there's been some increase in energy efficiency. So here are some examples. So the renewable capacity is still only about 11% or 12% in wind and another 5% of solar. So it's still quite small. There's been some increase in the efficiency of heating boilers and some insulation in houses. One of the problems in the United Kingdom is much of our housing stock is very old. Built before there were cavity walls. Not a cavity wall is where you have 2 brick layers with air in the middle. You can't insulate non-solid walls very easily. And car emissions, well, we all wonder how true these numbers are now, but new car emissions are really driven by European standards, not UK standards, and the proportion of cars that are electric in the UK is still very minute indeed. But there has been some progress. but it's not enough. So we are still saying to the government, we need to get on with more decarbonisation of electricity, we need to insulate more buildings, we need to have more electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We say 60% of all vehicles should be either electric or electric hybrids by 2030. You need to get people out of cars and into more energy efficient transport like cycling or foot or using public transport. We need to, for the remaining heavy industry in the UK and for any remaining gas-fired power stations, we need to have carbon capture and storage demonstrated at scale and implemented. And as I've said, we need to reduce emissions from agriculture. So what is the government's response to that? Well, unfortunately, not terribly positive at the moment. So, for example, under carbon capture and storage, the government did have a very large fund, public fund, for two demonstrator projects. One associated with a gas-fired power station, the other with heavy industry, manufacturing industry in the northeast of England. In the autumn financial statement, what we call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Chief Finance Minister, cancelled this funding for carbon capture and storage. And many of the schemes for funding home insulation have been cancelled. So I think overall 16 climate-related policies have been cancelled in the last year and a half. So it doesn't look terribly promising for the 2020s, although things could have argued, the government could argue have gone well so far. It's not clear they're going to go as well in the future. I want to say a little bit more about agriculture because, as I mentioned, that is particularly tricky. And if you look at where the agricultural emissions come from, as I said, it's about 9% at the moment of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the United Kingdom. Some of that is released from the soil, about 4%, and that's either because agricultural practice causes carbon to come out of the soil by ploughing up settled land and then it releases carbon, or by allowing, particularly we have a lot of peat bogs in the north of England and in Scotland, and policies that have been implemented over the last 50 years have essentially drained those peat bogs, so that instead of them being kept wet and holding moisture and therefore living sphagnum moss and retaining the carbon, they're now being drained for either farming or for grouse shooting, so they're releasing the carbon. So policies to manage soil sustainably are heading in the wrong direction. The other major sources of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are over-application of fertilizer or ruminant animals, ruminant digestion. And the one bit of good news is that in the UK the number of livestock has been decreasing, but that's not to do with climate policy, that's to do with the market for our competitive position in the market for dairy products and beef compared with other countries in Europe. So it's going to be tricky. How do you get agricultural emissions down? It's not easy because there are many hundreds of thousands of small individual businesses, farmers, who are not closely regulated. They basically do what they want to do. They get advice, but they do what they want to do. And there's a kind of special place, as I'm sure there is in the US, for farming in people's attitude towards the country. Much of the countryside of the United Kingdom, in fact virtually all of it, is managed by farmers, so they think of farmers as stewards of the land rather than villains who are producing greenhouse gases. And we all have wheat, so we need farming to produce food. There was an interesting paper in Nature Climate Change just last week by a group in Cambridge suggesting that one solution to this conundrum is land sparing. So what Andrew Balfour from Cambridge and his colleagues showed in the model was that if in the UK we farmed a smaller proportion of the land more intensively and left the rest of it unfarmed, either plant trees on it or leave it to accrue and store carbon through leaving it as wildland, that would have a dramatic effect on reducing agricultural emissions and allow us to meet the 80% reduction from agriculture. So that's only one perspective, and there's no evidence that that's going to be adopted. Question about price. Will renewable electricity, if we are arguing there ought to be more renewable electricity be prohibitively expensive, and that's what a lot of the critics say. And this shows the estimate of the price per kilowatt hour of different forms of electricity generation, from gas on the left, and gas all depends on the carbon price. And I haven't mentioned this, but Europe operates a cap and trade scheme for power generation in heavy industry. So there is a price of carbon. At the moment, the price, Dave was asking me this yesterday, the price is about €7 per tonne. In order for this cap and trade scheme to be effective, the price needs to be more like 60 or 70 euros per tonne. Why is the price so low? Because the European Commission that controls this scheme issued far too many carbon permits. So the scheme exists, but it's not effective. So at current market price, gas is cheap, but if the market price of carbon was higher, gas would not be so cheap. This is onshore wind, nuclear, large-scale solar PV, offshore wind, gas with carbon capture and storage, and tidal lagoon. So it's true that renewable energy is more expensive than burning fossil fuels, burning gas, but that is only true if you have a very low carbon price. And it won't be true in the future as the renewable technologies become cheaper to implement at scale. If you look at it in terms of what it costs people in the home, because that's always the argument, poor people won't be able to afford their heating bills, this is our estimate of the green bit is the extra charge from low carbon policies. So it's a relatively small, around 10% of energy bills costs are to do with renewable energy policy. But it is a tax, it's no doubt, we can't deny it, but it's relatively small. I mentioned the European Union, and I mentioned that the European Union, the 27 countries, has an agreement, a legally binding agreement to reduce carbon emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, which is lower, less ambitious target than our own national target of 57% by 2030. We think that we've got to get to there in order to manage the last 20 years to get to 80% below 1990. And I mentioned that the carbon trading scheme for Europe covers heavy industry and power generation, but is totally ineffective at the moment because too many permits have been issued. I want to just briefly touch on aviation. As I said, international aviation shipping is not included in the legislation, or at least it's ambiguous about it. But we say that aviation emissions should be capped at the 2005 level, and that if you did that, that would imply 81% cuts elsewhere to meet the budget. How is that cut going to be achieved? Some of it will be through the increased efficiency of aircraft engines. We think biofuels we're pretty sceptical about, and I can talk more about that if you want to in the question and answer. But the bottom line is that if there were unconstrained growth of aviation, it would have increased by 150% by 2050. That's the market analyst assessment. But in order to meet the target, growth will have to be capped to no more than 60%. So this is an unwelcome message for the government that you'll have to limit the amount of flying that people can do if you want aviation to play its role in meeting the carbon target. And finally, before I leave, talk about mitigation, this is just to underline that all I'm talking about is the bottom line here is UK production. The top line is our footprint from consumption. And that's not included in the Act, because if we buy stuff that's made in China and the Chinese have got emissions, that's their problem, not ours. Question whether that should be correct. But I want to switch now briefly, I'm going to spend less time talking about adaptation to climate change, and I want to make the point that adaptation is more difficult to measure. Mitigation, there's a clear target, we know how to measure it, you can build up a carbon budget, and there are people who spend all their time measuring these things, and we identify, we know the source of emissions, and the same structure applies globally. Adaptation, on the other hand, nobody knows what adaptation looks like. We don't know what we're adapting to because there's uncertainty about local and regional climates, and it's not a global issue, it's a local and regional issue. But how does it work according to the Act in the United Kingdom? Well, there's a very well established process which starts with our National Climate and Weather Service, the Met Office we call it, the Meteorological Office, they have to produce, they're obliged by law to produce climate projections for the United Kingdom. The last one they produced was 2009, the next one will be produced in 2017. And the law says that those projections have to be used to make a climate change risk assessment every 5 years. And that climate change risk assessment is then turned into a government response, which is the National Adaptation Programme, and that the Adaptation Subcommittee, the committee that I chair, reports to Parliament every 2 years, starting last year, on whether this National Adaptation Programme is fit for purpose and whether it's being implemented. So the projections, what is the UK's climate likely to be like? Higher temperatures, wetter winters, drier summers. Sea level rise is going to be very important because a lot of the United Kingdom is very low lying, particularly on the east coast, already often submerged at high tides and strong winds. And importantly, increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. And the biggest single risk identified from the climate change risk assessment, I won't go into all of it, is flooding. And I just want to say a little bit about flooding because in the last 7 years, the UK has experienced unprecedented flooding. Now, of course, we can't say that any one of these events is due to climate change. If each time it happens, including this year, it's completely unheard of, and everybody says, wow, we've never experienced anything like this before, but we may be going to experience it more in the future. So here's one assessment, not just for the United Kingdom, for the whole of Western Europe. The return period for 1 in 100-year events may be more like 1 in 10, 1 in 20 by the late 21st century. So winter 2014 in the United Kingdom was the wettest since records began. And this guy was the minister in charge of the environment who lost his job shortly afterwards because he was to blame for flooding. In December this year, just a month ago, record rainfalls. I think you had 4 inches of rain here a week or 2 ago, which is roughly 10 centimetres, 100 millimetres. In this part of the northwest of England, they had 400 millimetres in 48 hours and 300 millimetres in 24 hours. So a lot of rain. And as a consequence, many homes were flooded, lost power, major rail line between England and Scotland was cut off. The flood defences that had been built a few years earlier, when there had been a previous flood, were overwhelmed. And the same thing happened on the east side of England a week later. This is the city of York, historic city which was very, very heavily flooded, and more recently the city of Aberdeen on the east coast of Scotland. So what's going on? Partly these events are getting more severe and more frequent, perhaps a result of climate change, certainly what we might expect. There's a huge debate about how much is being spent on flood defence, but clearly not enough is by the existence proof of all the flooding. But more interestingly, also, we are still in the United Kingdom building houses on floodplains more rapidly than anywhere else. So a lot of these homes that are flooded have only just been built. And there's no integrated plan to manage water. So it's all done by hard engineering rather than by thinking about waterfalls. Water has to go somewhere. You can't get rid of it. If you stop it landing and absorb into the soil on the hills, then it will rush down into the valley and you can't canalize it forever. And there's a very low uptake of sustainable urban drainage, and individual households are not incentivized to improve the resilience of their homes. So all of these policies that need to be there to increase resilience are lagging behind. This is just one quantitative illustration. So here are the number of properties at significant flood risk today, 330,000. The effects of climate change over the next 20 years are likely to add another 300,000 roughly. This is the reduction in that risk due to expenditure on flood defences. So flood defences aren't going to help very much. This is what could be done by improving property level resilience. But actually what is being done is this little tiny pale brown bar. So although there's a potential to reduce the risk, it's not being managed effectively today. I now want to switch to a slightly broader and slightly different theme, and I'm on shakier ground here, I freely admit, because I want to talk about economics and about human behaviour. And the question really is going back to the mitigation part of the story. is it compatible to have economic growth and at the same time reduce greenhouse gas emissions? If you ask economists, and I apologise if some of you in the room are economists, you don't tend to get an agreement. So here are two examples. This is what Joseph Stiglitz says in his book Freefall: if all those in developing countries try to imitate America's lifestyle, planet's doomed. And I mentioned that the average American citizen's carbon footprint is 20 tons of carbon per person per year, and what we need to get down to is 2. If poor countries said we'd rather be like you Americans, can we have our 20 tons per person per year? Steve is to say things ain't going to work. On the other hand, you turn to another very distinguished economist, Nicholas Stern, who is at London School of Economics and produced a report year before last, September 2014, called Better Growth, Better Climate. And you can see that he takes a completely different view. He disagrees with Stiglitz that getting rich and acting on climate are incompatible. He says it's based on fundamental misunderstanding, and that we shouldn't think of simply linearly extrapolating what's happened in the past, but think of a new, completely different economy in the future. So you can either be an optimist or a pessimist, and I leave it hanging as a question. What I would say is that the concept of economic growth is a relatively recent invention. And this extremely good analysis by American economist Joel Mokyr shows that between around 1000 AD and 1750, there was no economic growth. People didn't get any richer. And what changed was the Industrial Revolution. After the Industrial Revolution, suddenly people started getting richer. Everybody, not disparities didn't necessarily diminish, but everybody got richer. So we lived in a relatively short phase since 1760, under 300 years, in which economic growth is the norm. So maybe it's a temporary phase. But one way of looking at the disagreement between Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern is to say, well, if we're getting richer and using more stuff, but at the same time we're taking the carbon footprint out of production, then maybe the equation will balance. If the rate of decarbonisation matches the rate of growth and the increase in population, maybe we're all okay. Now here's just one book that estimates that. This is Tim Jackson's book. Since 1990, indeed the carbon intensity of production has gone down to about 0.7% per annum. But on the other hand, population's gone up at 1.3% per annum, per capita income's gone up at 1.4% per annum, and up to last year, CO2 emissions globally have been going up about 2% per annum. So Jackson argues that to meet the target of stabilizing CO2 at this safe level, compatible with 2 degrees rise, we need decoupling of growth and carbon production at about 10 times the present rate. So if you take that as the answer, we're going to have a real industrial revolution to produce stuff in a way that uses much less carbon than we use at the moment. But there's also a wider question about the value of economic growth. And probably the best book I've ever read on this, best is defined as I agree with it. The best book I've ever read on it is by Robert Nedrowitz-Kudelski, and it's called How Much is Enough? And they start with a lecture that the English economist John Maynard Keynes gave in 1928, in which he talked, it's called Economic Prospects for Our Grandchildren. And what Keynes said in this lecture was, as technology improves, work will become more efficient. We'll be able to manufacture things with less effort. We'll be able to do stuff with less effort, which of course has turned out to be true, because a lot of manufacturing is robotic. We don't have to go through the tedium of actually writing letters. We can send emails or text messages or whatever. So technology has made things much more efficient. But then Maynard Keynes went on to say that as a result of this, people would have to work less and less to earn enough money to live on. So he envisaged that people who were working, say, 40 hours a week in 1928 by, let's say, 1950, we'd only have to work 15 hours. And so the big issue for the future, for the grandchildren at the time that he was talking about, which is people around here today, including us, was that we'd have a lot of leisure time. And that would be a big challenge. Of course, it's turned out to be wrong, because people are working just as hard as ever. And what did Maynard Keynes get wrong? He got wrong, according to Skidelsky's analysis, the difference between need and want. So it's true that we could earn enough to pay for what we need, perhaps in half a week of work, but the problem is what we want is very different from what we need. What we want is often to have the same stuff that our neighbours have. So, you know, I know Dave's got a very fancy car, so I want to have a fancy car as well. Otherwise, I'll feel inferior to Dave and get one other way. I think personal Dave, but that's the way it is. So, I think there's a broader question about why we want to get richer. There's a side issue, which I'm not going to go to, is about whether GDP is a good measure of the health of our nation. Just one little snippet that I learned from the former Chief Secretary of the Treasury in the United Kingdom, that according to global agreements, in calculating GDP, prostitution and drug dealing are in, but voluntary work, charitable work is not. So only all those millions of people who were doing charitable work could switch to becoming prostitutes and drug dealers, we've all been got rich. More quantitatively, there are a lot of analyses of whether well-being increases as we get richer. And this is a common form of graph. This one's actually showing life expectancy against average annual income and comparative purchasing power. And each dot is a country, so the United States is out here, and poor countries, sub-Saharan African countries, are down here. And the striking thing is that with increasing average annual income, life expectancy does increase, but then it steadies off at quite a low, sort of $15,000 a year, and there's no gain in life expectancy from being richer than that. And there are similar graphs for measures of happiness. Now, one of the things that Skidelsky does in his book is to do a surgical deconstruction of this kind of analysis, largely on the grounds that there are ceiling effects here. So, if you're already living to the age of 85 in this kind of economy, there ain't a lot of room, given the nature of decay of the human body, to get a hell of a lot older when you're as rich as the average citizen in the United States. So it's not clear what these graphs show, but it is surprising how life expectancy or happiness is unrelated to GDP over a very wide range. Here's one take on, why people consume. This is from Adam Smith, the famous economist of the 18th century, who basically said, just like I want to own the same sort of car that Dave owns, so no respectable labourer will be seen in public without a linen shirt, because you didn't have a smart suit to wear, you'd be disgraceful and impoverished. Finally, and I'm going to stop right now, is I want to just touch on the topic of behaviour change, because one of the things that is clear if we are going to meet the challenge of climate change is that all of us will have to accept certain differences in our lifestyle. It may be that we can't fly as much, as I've already indicated. Maybe we can't eat as much meat because of the carbon footprint of red meat. Maybe we'll have to be less likely to use our cars and more likely to use other forms of transport. So the question is, how easy is it for whole populations to change their behaviour? And I put stable planet and stable self, because often planetary health and human health will be interlinked in ways that things are good for the planet will be good for our own personal well-being. And this is a real conundrum, I think, for politicians, because many of the changes in behaviour we might seek are what might be called lifestyle choices. And whose job is it to determine how we lead our lifestyles? There has grown an industry in academia, which has been seized upon by politicians, of using insights from either behavioural economics or from marketing Marketing is the supreme example of where we persuade to behave differently by marketeers. Can we seize upon those insights and use those to get us to change our behavior at the population level in a way that would be good for the planet and good for ourselves? That's an open question. So let me end by summarizing. Paris was a good start, but will the commitments be fulfilled? Here's one example. One small country, a tiny country with a tiny fraction of global carbon emissions. We have very stringent legislation. We have independent scrutiny, the committee that I talked about. But nevertheless, the United Kingdom will have to up its game substantially to meet its legally binding commitments on both mitigation and adaptation. Question, I don't know the answer. Do we need to rethink about economic growth, or is it going to be all solved by innovation and technology? And are we going to be able to change our behavior? Do we need to change our behavior to meet the challenge of climate change? Thank you very much.
I'm Andrew Plantinga. I'm wondering if you could talk about why you think the UK decided to go ahead with an aggressive climate policy, given that, of course, for it to really make any difference at all, many of the rest of the world's countries will have to follow along.
So the question, just for those who didn't hear, is why did a tiny country with a tiny contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions choose to adopt such an aggressive piece of legislation? At the time, when the bill came through Parliament, the talk was all about leadership and the moral imperative to take action. So it sounds quite highfalutin, but I think it was genuinely a moment when the politicians thought we should show global leadership, and we have a moral responsibility, hence the equity argument that if everybody in the world could have 2 tons of carbon in 2050, we should try to be part of that story. I think it was driven as much by that as by the alternative, which I think is also quite plausible, that if you get ahead in this game, then the technological opportunities that are bound to open up can be yours for harvesting. So if it could be one of those cases where regulation drives innovation. Now that is certainly in some people's minds, but the reality is that hasn't played out quite as effectively as maybe people think. So I think it was primarily the moral compass argument, but there was a secondary and equally perhaps important argument about the innovation chance that will arise from the transition to a low carbon economy. The one area where the UK has probably led in terms of innovation is in offshore wind. And that's partly because we had a very large offshore oil and gas industry. So the engineering technology of building structures out at sea and maintaining them was something we had a very large expertise in. And that's served that particular sector well. But offshore wind is relatively expensive in spite of the technological advances. Yeah, blue diamond sweater. Oh, yeah.
Hi, Matt Burgess. So one thing that I think Keynes missed in his argument about leisure is the fact that when you automate the economy, you don't divide the pie up equally among people doing less work. What happens is whoever owns the machine gets all the money. And so, for example, I think that there are a lot of poor people, even in developed countries, that would strongly dispute the claim that they could have the lifestyle that they need to sustain themselves if they only worked a bit less. So with that, I know that there are a few countries that are considering guaranteed minimum income, and I wonder if that's something that's being considered right now in the UK.
Yeah, there is a national minimum wage, and the national minimum wage is not enough to live on, but the government has said, so what happens, sorry, I'm just getting a bit technical, so what happens at the moment, which was introduced by the previous Labour government back in 2008 or a bit earlier, there is what's called working tax credits. So if you're employed but you're not earning enough to live on, then you actually get, instead of paying tax, you get tax given to you. So you get a subsidy. So the present government has said we're going to abolish working tax credits, but what we're going to do is to raise the minimum wage to what's called the living wage, which is being determined independently by a charity as the wage that you could actually live a reasonable lifestyle. So that living wage will come in, I can't remember, 2019 or thereabouts. And the proposition to do that was a very rare instance where the legislation was overturned by the House of Lords. Not the legislation to increase the minimum wage, the living wage, but the legislation to abolish working tax credits. Normally, in the UK parliamentary system, the House of Commons has supremacy over the House of Lords. But because this change was introduced by secondary legislation rather than primary legislation, the Lords could throw it out, and we did, causing a great furor. It was the first time for a very long time the Lords had actually thrown out a piece of legislation. And so that's, the government is now stuck with both paying working tax credits and they will change it. They'll introduce it new piece of primary legislation to get around that. But coming to the substance of your point about inequalities, I think you're right, but nevertheless it is true when you look at the working hours of very wealthy people. They work extremely long hours too. I mean, my former students who've gone into banking, the ones who are really rich, will hopefully keep me in the staff which I'm accustomed in my old age. They're the people who have to be Canary Wharf in the City of London at 7 o'clock in the morning. They don't get home till 1 o'clock the next morning, and they're on $500,000 a year at the age of 28. So it's true that there are poor people who have to work all their hours that God gives them to make enough to live on, but there are very rich people who wouldn't, in theory, need to work that much, but they think that $500,000 a year is not enough to keep up the lifestyle they want, because they can only have one posh car like Dave Tillman. Right at the far corner back. Yeah.
Much like the U.S., the UK has benefited from low-cost gas, and without legislation, we've also reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by quite a bit because of gas availability.
Yeah.
What do you think would have happened if gas hadn't been available cheap? Do you think because the legislation was there that the UK would have hindered themselves economically and paid more? Or do you think it was just a fortuitous circumstance that gas came down? And furthermore, on your trajectory to the future, what if gas goes back up to $12, $13 a gigajoule like it was 10 years ago?
I mean, I really don't know what would have happened without the lifesaver of gas coming down. What if gas goes up? Well, in the Climate Change Committee's view, there really should be no fossil fuel electricity generation by 2050. So we've allowed in our forward projection for some gas in 2030, but ideally that wouldn't be there, and it certainly shouldn't be there by 2050. So our view is still that the country has to wean itself off gas for electricity generation. There may be still gas for home heating and for cooking, but that could be a relatively small amount. But your central question, what would have happened had it not been for a stroke of luck? I just don't know. I mean, the government's dead lucky. That's all I can say. I should have mentioned that also part of the reason for the fall in gas prices is, of course, fracked gas in the United States. And we are entering a big row in the United Kingdom about fracking. So there is quite a lot of gas, as you might expect, in a country that sits on massive coal beds. There's a lot of gas under the land in the UK that's being fracked, but it's very much in small pockets, so you have to drill a huge number of wells to get a reasonable amount of gas out. And also because the UK is a very densely populated country, everywhere you go, there are people living nearby, or there are beautiful landscapes that people living nearby don't want to be spoiled by fracking. And it's the first bids for planning permission, which were in Lancashire and northwest of England, were approved by the government and then turned down by the local planning authority. And now the government is in the process of overruling the local planning authority to permit fracking. And I don't know how that's all going to play out, but that's also part of the gas story in the UK. Yeah.
So I apologize, I don't know very much about UK politics, but it seems to me, I'm curious how we were able to pass this act considering that industry and consumers who purchase their goods, like utilities, are going to be facing rising costs. So it seems like it'd be a fairly unpopular act for a lot of industrial groups who oppose it. So maybe the interest groups in the UK don't have as much power as in the US. I'm curious how you're able to pass this bill through.
I mean, okay, so let's separate it out. The industry groups that are invested in hydrocarbons, their line, I mean, the two big hydrocarbon-based companies in the UK are BP and Shell. And BP have long taken the line that they will move out of hydrocarbons into renewables over the next 50 years. That means a long-term transition. Shell have not taken such a clear-cut line, but I guess what they saw is that this, whatever happened, this act, piece of legislation, will mean, it's going to be long-term. It will mean that for the next 20 or 30 years, we'll still be dependent on hydrocarbons. So for their foreseeable planning future, it wasn't a real threat. I think that's probably how they interpret it. And they interpret that they will have time to reconfigure as renewable energy companies or you making other use of hydrocarbons in the longer-term future. As far as householders are concerned and the impact on household bills, that, as I showed in one of my slides, the impact is there, but it's relatively modest compared with the fluctuations in other sources of energy prices. So if, as was argued back, if gas suddenly shot up, then household energy bills would go whopping up, and it would be actually in some ways better to have renewable energy where the fluctuation in price will be less than from hydrocarbons, because hydrocarbons are often priced at global levels. Renewables, if you're producing them yourself, you can set your own price. I think the big thing that you haven't also, no one's asked about is nuclear. So the UK is very committed to continuing its program of nuclear energy, and nearly all the power stations are coming to the end of their useful life in the next 20 years. So the government has embarked on a plan of building a whole fleet of new nuclear power stations. They're being built either by the French, have a very big nuclear industry, or the Chinese, or the Japanese. So we're not building them ourselves. And that's another whole, you imagine, controversy. Should we be having the Chinese building our nuclear power station? I'm not going to get into that debate. But that also is seen as a very secure, long-term source of electricity for base load. Because you've got a lot of wind, is what happens on the cold winters, high pressure days, when everybody wants to have their heating on, and the winters low.
We have time for one more question. You had your hand up several times.
Yeah, most of your analysis was based on CO2.
Yeah.
What about the other greenhouse gas emissions? Methane is playing a bigger role, and oxides and so forth.
In fact, I mean, I should have explained that more clearly. The vertical axis on most of the graphs was what's called CO2 equivalents. So what are called the Kyoto greenhouse gases, including methane, that were included in the Kyoto Protocol, are all included in the calculations, but they're expressed, as is conventionally the case, in CO2 equivalents. So you standardize it. Methane has a much more powerful global warming potential than CO2. So 1 unit of methane will be, I don't know, 10 or 20 units of CO2. So there's the standard currency for converting everything to dollars. So they're in there. I'm sorry.
Well, before we thank John for his talk, I want to remind you he'll be here the rest of this week and most of next week. He's teaching a evening class to, I don't know how many students, but maybe if you're not registered, you might want to think about that, that deals with science and policy and how they get along or don't get along. And with that, thank you, John.